Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I'm going to tell you a story that might just leave you speechless. Have you ever thought you were safe just because you wore the badge? Or because you did everything by the book? Well, what if I told you that in one fateful moment, a respected Navy officer was treated like a criminal simply because of the color of her skin? You won't believe how this unfolds. This story is about Lieutenant Commander Rachel Parker, a woman with a distinguished career, a Navy officer who thought she had nothing to fear as she cruised down a quiet suburban street in Atlanta. But little did she know, the officer pulling her over that night wasn't there to help. Officer Reynolds, a man drunk on power, was about to make a terrible mistake. As he escalated a simple traffic stop into an arrest, Rachel had no idea that the events of that night would spark something much bigger than a routine traffic violation. Imagine being in her shoes. You're calm, collected, and suddenly you're treated like a criminal. What would you do? Let's dive into Rachel's story and see how she fought back against an unjust system. Her strength, resilience, and refusal to be silenced not only changed her life, but could change the way we all look at justice. Stay with me till the end. You won't want to miss what happens when she stands up for what's right. If you've ever had an experience where you felt treated unfairly or wrongfully accused, drop it in the comments. I'd love to hear your story. As Lieutenant Commander Rachel Parker sat in her car, the soft hum of the jazz music filling the quiet night air, she couldn't have known what was coming. She had been behind the wheel for nearly 2 hours, driving through the winding streets of Atlanta, tired but focused. She wasn't in uniform that night, just a simple black sweater, jeans, and her hair pulled back in a neat ponytail. There was nothing that would make her stand out, or so she thought. But as she glanced in her rearview mirror, her stomach dropped. The flashing red and blue lights of a police cruiser were gaining on her fast. It wasn't uncommon to see a patrol car on a quiet night, but something about this felt different. She signaled, pulled over, and put the car in park. Her heart was racing, but not from fear. No, Rachel had been in the military long enough to know the drill. She kept both hands visible on the wheel, taking a deep breath, preparing for the inevitable. When Officer Reynolds stepped out of his car, his posture was tense, like a man who was expecting blind obedience. His boots scuffed against the asphalt, and his flashlight flickered on. Rachel watched him carefully through the side mirror, but she wasn't nervous. She knew the procedure. This wasn't her first time being pulled over. "License and registration," he barked at her. No greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, impatient, as if he already expected her to be compliant. Rachel calmly handed over her documents, but she didn't back down. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her tone steady, measured. She was trying to diffuse the tension, trying to keep things civil, but Reynolds wasn't having it. "Tail lights out," he grumbled, as though the matter was already decided. Rachel's frown deepened. "That can't be right," she replied, but before she could explain, he snapped, "Are you arguing with me?" A thick silence filled the air. Rachel felt the familiar shift, the moment when power met resistance, and she knew it. She wasn't just a woman on the side of the road anymore. In Reynolds' eyes, she was a problem to be dealt with, a threat to be silenced. She stood her ground, but Reynolds didn't want to hear her explanation. "Step out of the car," he demanded, his hand hovering dangerously close to his weapon. The tension was palpable now, and Rachel could feel the heat of the moment press against her skin. She was a Navy officer, a woman of authority, but she was just another black woman to this man, a target for his unchecked aggression. "Mind telling me why?" she asked calmly, but Reynolds only smirked. "Because I said so," he shot back. No reasoning, no explanation, just sheer, unadulterated power. Her heart raced, but her hands never shook. Slowly, deliberately, she unbuckled her seatbelt and stepped out of the car. Her posture relaxed but guarded. It happened fast. "Turn around, hands on the car," Reynolds barked. Rachel hesitated, just a beat. "For what reason?" she asked, her voice still composed, but she could feel the cold edge of danger inching closer. Reynolds' smirk faded, replaced by a glare. "Are you resisting?" he sneered, stepping closer, his tone shifting from arrogance to annoyance. Rachel had a choice: comply and fight this later, or resist and escalate the situation. But she knew this wasn't about the law. It was about something much darker: power, prejudice, and control. She wasn't about to let herself become another statistic, another black woman dragged through the system because of who she was. With slow, controlled movements, Rachel turned and placed her hands on the roof of her car, her breathing steady, her mind focused. Reynolds wasted no time, yanking her arms behind her back, cuffs biting into her wrists, far too tight. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured, but Reynolds just chuckled, oblivious to the fire that was brewing inside her. The next few moments were a blur. Rachel was shoved into the back of the patrol car, the metal seat cold against her skin. The door slammed shut, and she was locked inside, the flashing red and blue lights reflecting in the side mirrors, casting an eerie glow. But inside, Rachel didn't panic. She had faced far worse than this. What this officer didn't know was that he had just crossed a line, and he had no idea who he was dealing with. As Reynolds drove, his smugness continued, unaware of the storm he had just unleashed. He tried to belittle Rachel, to make her feel small, but she wouldn't play along. He thought he was untouchable, but in the back of his mind, he must have wondered what kind of woman would stand up to him in this way. "You must think you're somebody," he sneered, his voice dripping with arrogance. Rachel's lips curled into a faint smile. "I don't think. I know," she said softly, her words cutting through the tension in the car. The wheels of justice were beginning to turn, and Officer Reynolds had no idea that the moment he decided to arrest Rachel was the moment his own career would start to unravel. The cold metal of the holding cell was a stark contrast to the warm night outside. Rachel sat on the bench, her mind a whirlwind of emotions: anger, disbelief, and determination. As the minutes turned into hours, she allowed herself to process what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't just about her anymore. It wasn't just about the man who had abused his power. This was about something bigger, something that needed to be exposed. Outside the cell, the faint murmur of officers chatting at the front desk reached her ears. The sounds were familiar, the rhythm of a police station that she had visited many times before. But today it felt different. Today she was on the other side of the bars. She could feel the burn in her wrists from the too tight cuffs and the dull ache in her back where Reynolds had shoved her into the car. But the physical pain didn't compare to the weight of what was unfolding. She had been humiliated, assaulted, treated like a criminal. And for what? A traffic stop? No, this wasn't about a broken taillight. This was about control. This was about a system that couldn't see past her skin. Just as she began to gather herself, the heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway. Rachel knew who it was before she even saw him. Reynolds, the officer who had made this all possible. The man who thought his badge made him invincible. The man who would soon realize that no one was untouchable. He stood in front of the cell, his smug expression still in place. His arms were crossed over his chest, and his posture was as arrogant as it had been on the road. "Comfy?" he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. Rachel didn't flinch. She didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing her rattled. Instead, she leaned back slightly, letting her calm, composed presence fill the space between them. "I'm exactly where I need to be," she said, her voice low but firm. The smirk on his face faltered for just a moment, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. But he quickly covered it up with a scoff, rolling his eyes as if she were beneath him. "You know, if you just played along, we wouldn't be here," he continued, clearly trying to provoke her. "But no, you had to resist, and now you're in here." Rachel's jaw tightened. The audacity of this man to make her the problem, to act as if it were her fault that he had abused his power. She wasn't a victim of circumstance. She was a victim of a system that allowed men like him to thrive unchecked. But she wasn't going to let that system win. "Oh, I'm exactly where I need to be," she repeated, her words deliberate and sharp. The silence between them grew thick, and for the first time Reynolds seemed to hesitate. His bravado wavered, but before he could respond, a younger officer approached. He was holding a clipboard, his eyes darting nervously between Rachel and Reynolds. "We got a call," the officer said, his voice uncertain. "You need to see this." Reynolds frowned, irritation flashing across his face. "I'm busy," he muttered under his breath, but the younger officer persisted, stepping closer. "I think you should see this, sir." Rachel couldn't help but feel a surge of hope. The tide was turning. She had made one call, a simple, discreet call to a contact in her network, and now things were beginning to unravel for Reynolds. What he didn't know was that he had just made a huge mistake. The people who stood behind her were the ones who could expose him for what he truly was. A man drunk on power, hiding behind his badge. Reynolds reluctantly turned and walked down the hallway, his steps heavy, his arrogance replaced with annoyance. Rachel sat back, her mind working furiously. She had to stay calm, stay focused. This was just the beginning. She had to make sure that when the truth came out, it came crashing down like a tidal wave. Reynolds needed to know that the consequences of his actions would go far beyond this little holding cell. This wasn't just about him. It was about the system that had enabled him to get this far. Minutes passed before Reynolds returned, his face pale, his jaw tight with frustration. He slammed the door open, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What the hell did you do?" he spat, his voice low but furious. Rachel remained seated, unfazed. "I didn't do anything," she said, her tone steady, even. "But people talk, and some of us have friends in very high places." Reynolds' face darkened as the realization set in. The smirk was gone, replaced with genuine fear. He turned sharply, muttering something under his breath as he stormed off down the hallway. Rachel exhaled slowly, her heart racing with a mix of anticipation and relief. The battle wasn't over, but the tides were turning in her favor. The next morning she stood in the courthouse, the weight of the world on her shoulders, but also a sense of quiet confidence. Her day had begun just like any other, but today things would be different. She would not be a victim. She would not let this man's actions define her. The courtroom was cold, the silence deafening as the judge took his seat. Reynolds walked in, his posture still stiff, still trying to hold on to whatever shred of control he thought he had left. But Rachel knew this was his reckoning. As the prosecutor began to speak, the room grew tense. "We have reason to believe that the defendant, Lieutenant Commander Amara Lewis, was unlawfully detained without probable cause," he said, his voice carrying through the room. "Furthermore, new information suggests a pattern of misconduct involving the arresting officer, Sergeant Scott Reynolds." Rachel could see the impact of those words on Reynolds' face. His arrogance faltered. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the next bombshell. The prosecutor continued, his voice steady. "The body cam footage says otherwise. We have the evidence." The room erupted in murmurs as the footage was played, and Rachel stood tall, unshaken. Reynolds had thought he was untouchable, but today the truth was going to destroy him, and she was the one who would ensure that it did. As the body cam footage played in the courtroom, the gravity of the situation hit Sergeant Reynolds harder than any of the accusations leveled against him. His face, once full of smugness and self-assurance, now wore a mask of panic. His knuckles clenched around the armrest of the chair, as if trying to hold on to something, anything, that would prevent the world from crashing down around him. But nothing could stop the inevitable. The truth had been laid bare, and it was too powerful for even his badge to shield him from the consequences. Rachel watched it all unfold, her posture composed, but inside there was a storm of emotions. She had known the risks of standing up against someone like Reynolds, someone with the power of the law behind him. But the moment she had stepped into that holding cell, she had realized something crucial. This was bigger than just her. This was about accountability. This was about showing the world that no one, no matter their title or rank, was above the law. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had ever been wronged by someone in power, and for those who had no voice to speak up for them. The video footage played like an undeniable witness to Reynolds' cruelty. It was clear to everyone in the room that his actions had been nothing short of an abuse of power. He hadn't just violated protocol, he had violated the very principles of justice that he swore to uphold. The arrest, the unlawful detainment, the aggressive manner in which he had treated Rachel, none of it could be justified. The video showed everything, every moment of tension, every word that had been spoken, every movement that had escalated the situation. But it wasn't just the footage that spoke volumes. It was the silence that followed it. The silence from the officers who had stood by and watched. The silence from the police department that had allowed men like Reynolds to operate unchecked. Reynolds' defense was flimsy at best. He tried to explain away his actions by pointing to Rachel's so-called attitude and her uncooperativeness. But the prosecutor was quick to shut him down. Uncooperative? The prosecutor repeated incredulously. The footage shows Lieutenant Commander Lewis maintaining her composure, asking questions, and simply asserting her rights. You, on the other hand, were aggressive from the moment you made contact with her. You escalated the situation without cause, and now you are here, answering for your actions. Rachel didn't need to say a word. The truth was in the footage, in the damning evidence of Reynolds' behavior, but she couldn't help herself. As the judge declared the charges against her dismissed, she allowed herself a moment of triumph. Not because she was vindicated, but because the system, for once, had worked as it should. For once, the person who had abused their power would face consequences. Reynolds had thought his badge made him untouchable. He had thought his authority gave him the right to do whatever he pleased, without fear of repercussion. But now in the cold, sterile courtroom, the balance of power had shifted. For the first time, he was on the receiving end of justice. And it was a lesson he would never forget. When the judge's gavel came down, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively. The room, which had been thick with tension just moments before, now felt lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. The prosecutor nodded at Rachel, a silent acknowledgement of the victory. But Rachel wasn't focused on the applause or the victory in the courtroom. She was focused on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about one man losing his career. This was about the message it sent. This was about making sure that the system didn't forget who it was supposed to protect. As Reynolds was escorted out of the courtroom, his face pale and drawn, Rachel knew this was just the beginning. His suspension was inevitable, but it wasn't enough. He needed to be held accountable for everything. The internal investigation, the one that had been set in motion by his unlawful actions, would not be enough. Not when his colleagues had turned a blind eye to the years of misconduct that had gone unnoticed. The truth had been buried, but Rachel was determined to bring it all to light. The real battle had only just begun. A few days later, news spread like wildfire. Reynolds had been suspended, and the police department had launched an internal investigation. But it wasn't just his career that was in jeopardy anymore. The entire precinct was under scrutiny. People were talking. They were asking questions, and the more they asked, the more the cracks in the system began to show. The public demand for justice grew louder, and with it, the pressure on the police department to take real action. No one was backing down now. Not after Rachel had shown them that change was possible. She knew that the fight wasn't over. For every victory she claimed, there would be more battles to fight. But Rachel had proven something. She had proven that, even in a system that often felt stacked against people like her, the truth could still break through. The road ahead would be long and filled with obstacles. But she was ready. She would continue to speak up. She would continue to fight for justice. And she would make sure that no one else would ever have to face what she had faced, alone and unheard. For Rachel, the fight wasn't just about exposing one bad cop. It was about exposing the culture of silence and complacency that allowed men like Reynolds to thrive. And she would keep pushing, keep speaking, and keep fighting until the system was finally forced to reckon with the truth. And as she stood in the quiet after the courtroom, her attorney by her side, Rachel knew one thing for sure. She had started something that could never be undone. No matter how long it took, change was coming. And it was coming because she refused to be silent. The weight of the moment was not lost on Rachel. The days following the court case were filled with media interviews, press conferences, and a flood of messages from supporters. It was overwhelming, but it was also the kind of recognition she knew she had earned, not just through her strength and resilience, but through her unwavering commitment to justice. Despite the external applause and the public's rising admiration, something deeper had shifted inside her. This was no longer just about a personal victory. It was about transforming the system that had failed her, and so many others, for far too long. The aftermath of Reynolds' downfall had shaken the foundation of the police department. Internal investigations were underway, and the precinct was under intense scrutiny. The department couldn't hide behind its badges and blue walls anymore. The public was demanding change, and they had found a champion in Rachel. But she knew the battle didn't end with Reynolds' dismissal or the investigation into his actions. The real challenge lay in the bigger, systemic issue that had allowed officers like him to believe they could abuse their power without consequence. It wasn't just one bad cop. It was a culture that protected him and his kind. And Rachel wasn't naive enough to think that one conviction would change that culture overnight. Days turned into weeks, and the weight of this new responsibility started to settle heavily on Rachel's shoulders. She wasn't just a former Navy officer now. She was a symbol of resilience, of justice, of accountability. The calls kept coming, interviews with journalists, leaders from all over the country wanting her to speak about police reform. They wanted her to become the voice of change, the face of a movement that had been waiting for someone strong enough to lead it. But Rachel was determined not to let this moment become a fleeting headline. This wasn't just about one incident. It was about addressing the root causes of racial inequality within the law enforcement system. Her conversations with activists, community leaders, and even other police officers became more frequent. Rachel knew that the only way real change would occur was if the voices of those who had been silenced for so long were amplified. The stories of people like her, Black individuals who had been targeted, profiled, and mistreated by law enforcement, had to be told. Their experiences couldn't be ignored any longer. It wasn't long before Rachel found herself standing before the Department of Justice, advocating for concrete changes. She was no longer just talking about the problems she had faced. She was offering solutions. In her impassioned speeches, she discussed the need for more rigorous anti-bias training, mandatory body cameras for all officers, and independent civilian oversight boards that would ensure accountability. She wasn't there to criticize the police force as a whole. She was there to show that it was time for the department to take a hard look at itself, to confront the uncomfortable truths it had been sweeping under the rug for decades. It was at one of these meetings that Rachel met with law enforcement officials who genuinely wanted to make a difference. They were the ones who, unlike Reynolds, understood the weight of their badges and the responsibility they carried. Rachel spent hours discussing the nuances of policy change with these officers, working together to draft legislation that would ensure the safety of marginalized communities while holding bad cops accountable. She felt a glimmer of hope. There were still good people in law enforcement, people who understood that their power should be used to protect and serve, not to intimidate and oppress. But even as the wheels of change began to turn, Rachel could feel the resistance growing stronger in certain corners of the department. There were those who still viewed her as a troublemaker, a threat to the status quo. They were the same officers who felt that their authority had been challenged by her, and they weren't willing to let it go easily. The silence she had once felt from her colleagues, the cold shoulders, the averted eyes, was now replaced with something more sinister. Whispers in the hallways, subtle acts of sabotage. The climate at her department had shifted from one of support to one of subtle opposition, and Rachel could feel the pressure mounting. One evening, after another long day of meetings, Rachel sat at her kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of her. Her heart was heavy. She had given everything to this fight, to pushing for systemic change within a system that had failed her, and countless others. But she knew that the road ahead would only get harder. She couldn't allow herself to falter, to let the weight of the resistance pull her back into silence. This wasn't just about her career anymore. This was about creating a legacy of justice, a legacy that would ensure no one else would have to endure the same treatment she had. No other woman, no other person of color, should have to fight the system that was supposed to protect them. She thought about the night of the arrest, about the humiliation she had felt, the way she had been treated as if her life didn't matter, as if her badge meant nothing. But that moment had been the spark. It had lit something in her that she couldn't extinguish. It had reminded her of the power of her voice. And now, more than ever, she knew that silence was no longer an option. The following day, as Rachel prepared for yet another round of meetings, her phone buzzed. It was a text from her lawyer. The headline read, "Reynolds to face criminal charges." Her heart raced. She read through the message, her fingers trembling as the news sank in. The internal investigation had concluded, and Reynolds wasn't just facing suspension anymore. He was being charged with assault, unlawful detainment, and abuse of power. The charges were being brought against him by the Department of Justice, and the trial was set to begin in a matter of weeks. A wave of satisfaction washed over her, but it was quickly tempered by the realization that this was just one victory in a much larger battle. Reynolds was the first officer in a long time to face real consequences for his actions. But how many more were still out there, operating without oversight? How many more would continue to abuse their power until the system was forced to reckon with its own failures? Rachel wasn't sure when this fight would end, but she knew one thing. She would never stop pushing. She would never stop speaking. And no matter how difficult the road became, she would continue to lead the charge for justice, not just for herself, but for every person who had been wronged by the system. Because the fight for justice was bigger than one moment. It was a movement that would continue to grow, to build, to inspire those who, like her, refused to be silenced. And with each step, Rachel walked toward a future where true accountability would finally be the norm. The months that followed were filled with new challenges, but Rachel never wavered. As the dust settled from the legal battle with Sergeant Reynolds, the news of his criminal charges sent shockwaves through the police department and beyond. It was a turning point, not just for Rachel, but for the entire community. For the first time, there was a tangible shift in the way law enforcement officers were being held accountable. And while it wasn't a victory that would undo the years of trauma or injustice, it was proof that change could indeed happen. But Rachel knew that this victory, as significant as it was just the beginning. Every step forward felt like a small win, but the road ahead was still long. The department was reeling from the fallout of Reynolds' actions. There was tension in the air, a palpable sense of unease among those who had once believed they were untouchable. It was as if the very foundation of law enforcement had been cracked open, revealing the dark truths many had been trying to keep hidden. The case had become a symbol of systemic injustice, and Rachel had become the face of the movement for police reform. At first, the change felt like a small ripple in the ocean, a single stone dropped into the water, but Rachel could see that the ripple was spreading, growing, turning into a wave. It was becoming clear to her that there was no going back. She wasn't just fighting for her own dignity anymore. She was fighting for every individual who had ever been mistreated, ignored, or worse, abused by the very system that was meant to protect them. The pressure on Rachel increased as she continued to push for reform. The media attention didn't stop. As the story of her wrongful arrest continued to gain traction, it became the center of a broader national conversation about police brutality, racial profiling, and the need for sweeping changes in law enforcement practices. Politicians began to take notice, and within weeks, Rachel found herself in rooms with senators, congresspeople, and leaders from all across the country. They wanted her voice, her perspective, and they needed her to stand as a representative of what could be if the system were held accountable. Rachel had spent most of her life in uniform, either serving in the military or as a respected law enforcement officer. She had never imagined that one day she would be at the forefront of such a movement, but there she was, navigating uncharted waters. She knew the stakes were high, but what drove her forward was the faces of those who had been forgotten, those who had been silenced by a system that had allowed officers like Reynolds to flourish without consequence. She thought about the families who had lost loved ones, the people who had been unjustly incarcerated, and the countless others who had been forced to live in fear of the very people sworn to protect them. Her resolve grew stronger with each passing day, and she began to realize something crucial. This fight was not just about changing a few bad apples. This was about transforming an entire culture. But the road was not without its obstacles. As Rachel pressed forward, she found herself met with resistance from unexpected corners. There were members of the department who saw her as a threat, those who were still clinging to the old ways, who believed that the status quo had worked just fine. They didn't want to change, didn't believe they had to. Their power was being challenged, and they fought back in small, insidious ways. It was in the cold shoulders during briefings, the whispered conversations in hallways, and the veiled threats hidden in the form of bureaucratic red tape. Rachel had expected this resistance, but it didn't make it any easier to endure. She also had to contend with the ever-growing pressure from outside forces. Advocacy groups, journalists, and community leaders all wanted to see immediate action. They didn't just want promises. They wanted tangible results. The weight of their expectations bore down on her, and there were moments when she questioned whether she could bear it all. But deep down, Rachel knew she couldn't stop. She was too far into the fight, and her commitment to justice, her promise to those who had suffered, was far stronger than any resistance she faced. Amidst all of this, Rachel found solace in her family, especially in her daughter Mia. The days spent with her family, their quiet moments together, were a grounding force in her chaotic life. Mia, at such a young age, had no idea the battles Rachel was fighting. She was simply a bright, curious child who filled Rachel's heart with joy. And yet, it was for Mia, and for all the children like her, that Rachel continued to fight. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling day of meetings, Rachel sat in her office staring at the walls that had once felt like a refuge. Now they seemed like barriers, reminders of how much further she still had to go. Her phone buzzed on the desk. It was a text from Lisa, her attorney. "Reynolds has pled guilty. The trial is over. It's official." Rachel read the message again. She had anticipated this outcome, but hearing it made it feel more real. Reynolds was going to be held accountable for his actions. But even with this success, Rachel couldn't rest. She knew this moment would only mean something if it sparked true, lasting change. Reynolds' conviction wasn't enough. It couldn't be. This was about ensuring that future generations of officers would be trained differently, that future encounters wouldn't end with another innocent person's rights violated. This was about making sure that, no matter your rank, race, or background, you would always be seen for who you truly were, not just as a badge, but as a person deserving of respect and dignity. Rachel took a deep breath, and for the first time in a while, she allowed herself a small moment of relief. Her fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but this chapter had closed with a victory. She had proven that one person, standing firm in their truth, could make a difference. But there were more battles to fight, more injustices to right. She wasn't done yet. She stood up, her gaze fixed on the horizon outside her office window. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow across the city. In that moment, Rachel realized something powerful. The fight wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been silenced, forgotten, or ignored. And she would keep fighting for them, for justice, and for a future where no one ever had to fear the system meant to protect them. The road ahead would be long, but Rachel was ready for whatever came next. Because with each victory, with each person who stood beside her, the future was beginning to look a little brighter. The story of Rachel's courage and determination in the face of adversity offers several powerful lessons that resonate deeply, especially for those of us who have lived through different eras and seen countless changes in society. First and foremost, it teaches us that standing up for justice, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you, can spark change. No matter how many times life tests us, the key is not to retreat but to persist, because our voices have power. As we grow older, it's easy to feel like our time is behind us, but Rachel's journey reminds us that it's never too late to make a difference. Each of us, regardless of age, can challenge injustice and stand up for what's right, whether in our community or our personal lives. We may not always be able to change everything, but our actions, no matter how small, create ripples that can inspire others to do the same. So if you've ever felt like your voice wasn't being heard, remember Rachel's story. Take action, speak up, and encourage those around you to do the same. The fight for fairness and equality is not just for the young, it's for all of us, regardless of our age. Let's continue to stand together and make our world a better place, one brave step at a time. If you've ever experienced a similar situation or have thoughts on this topic, I'd love to hear from you. Please share in the comments below.